Hello, everybody. I hope your GDC is going well. I'm looking around the room and seeing the faces of everybody that's here. We have several educators with us here, which is absolutely awesome. So this is titled Not Just Another Rock Generator. And the idea behind the presentation is basically an introduction to proceduralism in general, not necessarily just for games, but this will definitely apply when you're creating assets for games. But the idea is, how does proceduralism work? What is it? What are the concepts behind it, and how you can apply it in your pipeline in different ways? So for some of you, this may be very basic information, but for others, this will be a brand new introduction to the concepts of proceduralism. So let's start talking about the fun stuff. Proceduralism. Just out of curiosity, does everybody know when I say what an attribute is in Houdini? Raise your hands if you say yes. Oh, great. This is the room. So we're going to be able to skip through some of this and save a little bit of time. The reason this is so important is because attributes are pretty much, to me, the key to how proceduralism works inside of Houdini, right? It's the variable where you store information that allows you to create proceduralism. So it's an important thing to understand, but all of the hands have gone up before, so this is awesome. So yeah, what does procedural mean to you? And this is literally a question. So anybody? Anybody? Give me a hand. Yes, sir. Oh, you're going to get the catch box.
I think got it.
There you go.
So, procedural is to mechanically process bits of data to generate things based on variation.
Okay, yes, very much true. There is definitely a process that takes place, and you're definitely generating things based off of that process. That is 100% true. Are there any other ideas or thoughts on proceduralism?
Make functions to do stuff for you. If you cannot draw or paint, just do it procedurally.
Correct. Functions to be able to do things for you, to be able to create things for you. If you're lacking in a particular area, you can actually use proceduralism to build tools to create assets that you on your own without it might not be able to generate, right? So that's very awesome. And those are really good inputs on proceduralism. The conversation that kind of shifts a little bit is when people say, well, I don't want to use proceduralism because it's so mechanical. Or because it's like a machine and I don't have any art direction. I don't have any control over what it is that I'm producing. And that's really important when we're talking about entertainment, especially games, right? So the idea is that with the newer releases of Houdini and with the way that proceduralism works, especially through Houdini Engine and working with the game dev tools and being able to export this proceduralism into game engines, you no longer have to choose between art directability and proceduralism. The idea is that you have both now, right? So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the fact that it's not just automation, but that it's the ability to create more beauty with less pain, right? That's the key to the whole thing. This image that you're seeing right here was actually created by a student that was a Houdini user and developed it in a very short amount of time and was able to populate giant cities procedurally and create a very, very beautiful image. So again, it doesn't have to be something that's mechanical. It can definitely be organic and artistic and art directed, right? So the way that I like to think about proceduralism is to think about what proceduralism is not, okay? So think about the idea of wood, a chunk of wood or a tree, right? You can carve a tree and make it whatever shape that you want using, is my mic, it's weird, using wooden carver's tools, right? So I can go in there and I can whittle away a chunk of wood. I can whittle away a piece of it. But as soon as I do, that piece of wood is on the floor, right? So I have now made an edit of my tree that is unrepairable, right? It is not something that I can go back and make a change to. I'm not able to make anything except the one shape out of that one tree that I carve with these tools. And the way that I like to think about that is that's how traditional modeling typically works. All right, if you go in and you Boolean out a chunk of geometry, that chunk of geometry is pretty much gone. That's an edit that's been made to that geometry and it's locked at that point in the creation process, okay? Houdini works a little bit differently, right? The procedural way of thinking about things is not that I'm going to use a set of tools to carve this one tree into being a particular shape, right? Like if I wanted a really fancy toothpick or a wizard's wand, right? Let's go Harry Potter for a second. It's the ability to be able to use those tools to create one item. Houdini is more like a factory, right? It's the ability to take in some sort of substance, in our case, wood for this example, and then have that factory be able to generate multiple iterations of that item, right? So the problem with that is what happens when the bottom falls out of the magic wand market, right? Now all of a sudden I've got a factory that makes magic wands and nobody wants magic wands, right? So you don't burn the factory to the ground and start over and rebuild a brand new factory. You tweak the factory. Because what I noticed on the stock market was that broomsticks are now the hot new item. So I need to be able to make broomsticks, not magic wands. But I can use the same exact factory to take in trees, and with just a couple of adjustments to my machine, I can now produce a new product out of that same exact tree, right? So it's a little abstract concept right now. We're going to see it all work in Houdini in just a second. But again, the idea is I have a perfectly good working factory. I have a perfectly good principles of proceduralism that I can use. I just need to tweak my machine a little bit to get different results, okay? The other idea is that people that are traditional modelers often think that you need to know all of the math ahead of time, that you have to know everything about the proceduralism prior to getting started. And that's not necessarily true. The way that I created the examples that we're going to see, and by the way, I just want to preface this with I am not an artist by any means. I am an educator, I am a teacher, so the models that you'll see are not necessarily really high, great looking models, but they illustrate the principles of what we're talking about very clearly. So when I was modeling these huts and trees and rocks that you're about to see, I went through and created them in a way that they just worked, right? But as I was building them, I would say, hey, what if this tree was a little bigger at the base? So I'd branch off and make one that was a little bit bigger at the base. As soon as you do that, as soon as you start sort of mentally sketching and playing with the art to come up with different concepts, that's a key. It's a trigger that should tell you this is a place where proceduralism could play very nicely, okay? So because of that, what I did is I would go through and mark the nodes as green. Green just meant, hey, when I come back to proceduralize this, these are the nodes that I'm going to focus on because these are where the variation that I was playing with mentally when I was developing it was taking place. So yeah, the idea being that as you sketch and build, think about how you would use proceduralism, and those triggers should be areas where you start to play with creativity, where you start to branch off a little bit. That's where your proceduralism will really start to play when you start working with variation. So the way that this basically works is, yeah, this is not just another rock maker, but the first thing we're going to look at is how to make a rock, okay? And then we're gonna look at how that machine is built. And then we're going to say, how do I now change this from being a rock maker to being a hut producer or a tree producer, right? Or some other things without changing the base machine that we're going to create. So it's the idea of having a factory that produces wands, and now I can have that factory produce broomsticks or toothpicks or baseball bats or whatever it may be with just making a few tweaks to what I'm giving to the machine and how the machine works. So that means that instead of just making a rock machine, what we're going to make is an anything machine. Right? It's a thing maker is what we're creating, not necessarily just a rock generator. So in the process of doing this, what you're going to see is that there are 3 different implementations of proceduralism. The first one is basically just creating a series of objects that all have similar qualities, but are all each unique in their shape and their visual quality. Right? So if I need 100 rocks and I need to scatter them across a terrain, I can have all 100 rocks look like they belong in that environment, but they're all unique and individual, right? So I don't have the same rock over and over and over. The second way that we're going to apply this is to actually be able to do layout and design. So we're going to be able to take the uniqueness that we have and the variation that we're able to produce through proceduralism and start to lay out what could be maps for playability, okay? And the third way we're going to look at this is to do look development, which is a single individual asset. In the case we're going to see here, swords. And I took the swords and I broke it down into elements where you have the handle and the hilt and the blade, right? But through the proceduralism, I can actually say I've got 6 different blades. I've got 4 different handles and 3 different hilts. What are the possible combinations of all of these looks when I throw them together, right? It could be hundreds of different options of how these pieces could be assembled to create a sword. But they all look like they came from the same blacksmith, right? In the same time period. But maybe I just don't know which one the hero gets and which one the orcs get or whatever it might be. So through this way, we're able to actually do a little bit of look development and design. So 3 different ways that you'll see proceduralism implemented. And now we cross our fingers and jump right in to show you what it looks like live. So first we'll take a look at the actual rock. So the rock itself is pretty simple. It's a sphere with a little bit of noise put on it, right? And then I just made sure that it was sitting on the base and that it was sized to a unit size. So it was sitting right on the ground and then it was a unit size. Then I did a little poly reduction so that I'm not working with too crazy geometry. And that's basically my rock. So this becomes my rock. Now as I was doing this rock, I noticed that the noise that I apply, let me just frame it here. The noise that I apply to the rock is what pretty much defines its visual element, right? So if I wanted to offset that noise, it would actually allow me to generate different types of rocks that all use the same noise but have a little bit different look. For example, we'll just lay down this mountain node. This is how I'm generating the noise, right? And let's see what that looks like, excuse me, on this particular rock. So I know the noise that I used here was 0, 0, 0, that I had a smaller height. Or let me do this. Let's do it this way. Let's copy this thing. We'll paste this over here. And we'll just look at this duplicate. And we'll delete these channels and reset to defaults. Okay, so here's my actual rock. So as I'm playing with this rock, I'm playing with different forms of noise, and I start looking at which noises are going to produce the rock shapes that I actually like. So as I'm doing this, I'm thinking, hey, you know what? Changing this noise type is going to be something that actually allows me some variation. The problem is this makes it look like these rocks are coming from absolutely different worlds, right? So this is the same exact noise, well, different noise pattern with the same exact settings. This no longer belongs with the rock from the other noise set. So if I was going to scatter these across the terrain, this is something I'm going to play with for creativity, but it's not something that I'm going to use for proceduralism, because this is going to vary the shapes of the rocks and put them so far outside of the family that they no longer belong together, right? So what is it that I can actually change and play with here? So I like this look, this particular noise, the whirly cellular looks good, but I want to be able to create different ones. So I started playing around with things like offset. And I noticed that as I move the offset or shift the offset, it allows me to have a lot of different rocks, all using the same visual style, but each one being just a little bit unique, right? So what can I do that will allow me to drive this offset randomly throughout a bunch of different rocks? So what I did is I said, okay, this is going to be where I'm going to lay in my proceduralism. I know this is the node where proceduralism is going to go, and I've already figured out which parameter I'm going to use to create that proceduralism. So in doing so, I mark it green and then just continue with my workflow. Now, let's talk about the actual machine, okay? What the machine does is it takes an input. This is going to be our item that we want to create, so a wand or a toothpick or a baseball bat. And then my machine is this, what's happening here inside this little black net box. And all this is a grid and some points that are scattered onto the grid, right? And then I run a copy node through a for loop. And basically all that says is for each one of these points that's out here in this field, put a rock on it. Now you could say, great, you could just copy the points and it does the same thing. Why would you run it through a for loop, right? Well, the idea is that with the for loop, I have the ability to grab a particular piece of data that's unique for each point. Okay? So all those points that are scattered out there have individualism, and in this case, it's a number, point number 1, point number 2. You can see it when you actually turn on your point numbers, right? So I can actually use that individual unique quality to drive a random function that will randomize the offset of the noise on my rock. Okay? So what does that look like in the long run? Well, let's plug it in and see. So let's go ahead and take our rock and plug it into our machine. Gives it just a second, and hey, here we go. Let's turn off our points. I've got a field of rocks where each rock looks a little bit different, but they all use the same noise as a base, right? And the reason that is because there's a random function that's driving based off of each individual point number. So rock number 1 gets a value that's different than rock number 2, that's different than rock number 3, and all it is it's offsetting the noise. And here's that little function right here, okay? So it's just one little line of it's not even code, it's one little expression that goes in there that creates that proceduralism. The thing is not necessarily knowing that one little line of expression, it's knowing where to put it and how to use it to be able to maintain creativity and art directability, right? So this is great, I've got rocks. I can generate individual and unique rocks. Wonderful, John, what now? Well, the next thing that I wanted to be able to do was to build some huts. So just some little shacks where people might live in the village in this little town, right? So one of the things that I did as I was doing this, again, started off with just a box, moved a box over and to become the roof, did a little edit to it so that I got a shape for the roof. And one of the things I did when I was modeling this, just as you would when you were normally modeling, was to grab these faces and move them around a little bit. Well, I thought to myself, hey, what if each of the huts had a little bit different roof height? Because they're all made by different people, but they're all in the same village with the same resources and the same environment, so they're all going to have the same shape and visible structure, but they're all going to be made by different villagers, so they're going to have a little bit unique quality to them. This is a really good spot where I could plug in proceduralism. So you go through and you mark it green. You know when you come back, when you've got the final look for your hut, you know where to add in that little bit of creativity. The other place that I did this was where I created the doors. So the size and shape of these doors where people would come in and out, I thought if those doors were just a little bit different, a little bit narrower, or a little bit wider, or a little bit taller, or a little bit shorter, it would be another really great way to add in that uniqueness. So again, I marked where I laid in the Boolean, in other words, where the box that cuts out the door, I marked where that shape is defined so that I can go back and add proceduralism to that. Now the final image is a little hut that looks like this. But hey, let's look at what it looks like when we run it through our machine. Now this was our rock making machine. I'm not going to change the machine. I'm just going to give it a little bit different thing. We're going to give it huts now. And when we zoom out now, instead of rocks, we've got individual huts, each one with a little bit unique style on the roof, right? And each one with a little bit different window or door frame size at the very beginning where people can come in and out. Now you might say, hey, this is really extreme, and I don't want those to be that extreme. This is where the art direction comes in, where somebody says, I don't want my roofs to be quite that high. Like that's too high for the general look that I want. And some of them actually they invert, and I don't really like that. So the art directability of this comes into play where you've already got your proceduralism marked. Right? So you know that's what's creating that individual difference. So now I can come in here and I can say, cool, instead of those going from -2 to 1 in height, or to 8 in height, I can change one little thing and say, hey, the max height of any of those is going to be 2. Now the max height of any of my roofs is going to be 2. So this is a very simple example with very basic geometry, right? But imagine we were doing a parking lot full of cars at a mall. And we wanted different color cars, and we wanted different types of cars, some of them to be coupes, some of them to be sedans, some of them to be pickup trucks, some of them to be dump trucks, right? You now have this ability to go through with this proceduralism of scattering and this uniqueness of individual car and apply it to all different elements of your base concept, which is vehicle. And then you can plug vehicle into your machine, and boom, you got a parking lot full of totally unique vehicles that are all art directed to be from the same era of time, right? Okay, so we've made some huts. That's really cool. And the other thing that I wanted to create were some trees. And the trees were very, very straightforward. I just started with a tube. And then I did another tube on top of it and did some different little directional edits to it to give it some sort of umbrella effect to make something like a tree. And I thought, well, that's great, but I really want to be able to control, obviously, how wide these trees are, how tall these trees are, how thick they might be. So I went through and found those areas again as I was building. I marked them for where I was going to add in my proceduralism, and then ran them through my machine. And what I got at the very end of this was something a little bit goofy. So my umbrellas for my trees are a little bit too large here, right? So this is an area where you can go through and do some art direction. I can come back again, as I had said before, and just find those areas and then change that fit distance. So instead of the trees being a maximum size here, I can actually change it to be whatever I want it to be, just like we did with the heights of the roofs of the houses, right? So all of that to say, this is one particular way of using proceduralism, which is generating a bunch of different things that are each individually unique but look like they belong in the same family, okay? We talked about that being one style of proceduralism. The other one is to actually use proceduralism to start doing things like a level design or layout, right? So how would we do that? Well, what I wanted to do was to be able to scatter rocks, trees, and huts across on my land, and still be able to use the uniqueness and individualism that I'm pulling from everything else. So what I did is I said, hey, let's do a switch node. And all a switch node does is when it goes through the for loop, it looks at a point and it says, hey, what goes on that point? Well, let's throw a random value up to the switch. Okay, this time I'm picking a rock. Okay, here's the next point. What's going to be on the next point? Well, the next point, let's go to the switch, give it a random value. Hey, this time it chose a house or a hut. The next time around, it chooses a tree, right? Now you're able to maintain the uniqueness of those trees, huts, and rocks because we built it into the proceduralism here. But now we're actually using a switch node to drive layout and design. So let's go ahead and plug those in. We say, hey, I'm going to want some trees. I'm going to want some huts. And I'm going to want some rocks. Now let's plug that into our machine. Same machine. Nothing has changed about the development of the machine, right? And now all of a sudden, I'm starting to get something that looks like a little village with rocks, trees, and huts involved. And I can say, well, I don't really like that design. I know I've got an art-directed approval for the look of each of the individual elements that's in there, but I want to now be able to, at a higher level, start looking at how those designs look, right? Well, let's say I wanted to scatter only 50 items. So in one button, I can scatter only 50 items. What if I want a really, really densely populated area? Well, I can go through and create a much more densely populated area just by saying more points, more items, right? If that's the number of items that I like, but I don't like the particular layout, I can go in and change the seed for the random that drives what the switch is. So I give it a different value. Now all of a sudden I'm going to get an exactly the same amount of density in my village with my art-approved items, but a completely different and unique layout. Okay, so if you wanted to, I didn't do it here, but if you wanted to, imagine taking this idea of this being 1 acre of land, okay? I can take this machine now and duplicate it, put it down here, and scatter a bunch more points and say, for each of those points, give me a unique acre of populated land. So now I'm able to plug one machine into another duplicating machine, and now I can cover miles and miles and miles of land with uniquely generated houses, huts, and rocks, and still be able to have art-directable control over the entire system, right? So one thing builds on another. It's the idea of stacking to be able to do this development, right? So that was just the idea of, second idea of using proceduralism in your workflow, right? You can actually use it to not just do individual uniqueness in items, but also to do the creation of levels and layouts. But the last thing was, how do I do this to do something like look dev? So one of the templates that I used to plug into my machine was a sword, right? We talked about that. So what a sword looks like when I was done with one was something along the lines of this, okay? But I thought, what if I had different blade shapes? Well, the blade is created, there's the grip, there's the hilt, and there's my blade. So all I did with my blade was I created different looks. I have one that's kind of curvy, I have one that's sort of fat, and I have one that has these little weird wobbles in the side. Then, of course, we just use the switch. We've already seen how the switch works. It chooses, it makes a choice between one of those three looks, and it applies it to that individual sword, okay? So that's the blade. We did the same thing with the hilt and the hilt decoration. So a hilt looks something like this. This is the part, of course, where the blade comes down to meet the handle. And then I have different decorators that go onto those. Some of them are round, some of them are square. Again, here's a switch that's pulling either a sphere or a box to put on the end of each of those things. Okay, so we get something like that that sits on the end. Yep, perfect. And then the next thing that we do is we develop the grip, which is the actual handle. And I actually went through and said, hey, give me 2 or 3 different ideas of what that handle might look like. So I've got one that looks like this, and one that looks like this, and one that looks kind of like this. And again, as I was doing these things, I was marking where I wanted my proceduralism and then putting my individual random function in that area. So now I've got this sword with all these different elements that are put together. What does it look like now when I run that through my machine? Well, I can run it through my machine, give it a second to generate some stuff. And when I back off, I can now see that I have a field full of unique swords. Each one is going to look a little bit different than the other one. Now, some of them are going to look a little extreme, right? But the idea is that we want to test the limits of what can we achieve with these different art-directed approved looks by combining them in very unique ways. And again, again, I say I am not an artist. So imagine what this would look like if you had a real artist that was making these models, right? So that's the general idea. 3 different ways of using that proceduralism and 3 different ways of being able to use it in your workflows. Since we've talked about that, let's go ahead and wrap up with this. So you might say, how does this kind of proceduralism benefit me? How am I going to be able to use this myself? Well, the idea and the ability to see hundreds of variations on a concept almost instantly. Like, that is an incredible benefit, right? Art directable templates, the idea that you can make these individual items like we did with the huts and the rocks and the trees and still have them be art directable. So we did one little element, which was a noise offset, but you could do that with the UVs, with the textures, with lighting information, with anything that you wanted inside the world of Houdini, right? So asset generation, also the ability to develop unlimited unique assets that all belong within the same family, right? The rocks belong to the same land. The swords were all made by the same blacksmith. And then at the very end, the idea of the mechanics of it, right? Let's have some time savings and let the machine do the work. So instead of me being a modeler that's going to go through and model 100 different unique sword looks, let's make the machine do all the work for me. I need 100 different looks. Cool. I'll model 3 different elements and put them together and say, machine, give me some options. And that's it. So anybody that's looking forward to continuing to learn more Houdini, more about proceduralism, more about procedural modeling and how it can work for you in your games, please check out the SideFX.com tutorials page. And that's it. That's it for me. If anybody has any questions or anything, great. I think we're right at time, too.
Or, yeah, we can wrap it.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thanks, you guys.
I'll be around.
Yeah, I'll be around. Grab a card, meet me in the hallway, whatever you want.